Hey there, and welcome to After Hours. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the second part of the Flamenco Panel by Northcott. Now, in this episode, we're going to be looking at the preparation to start the quilting process. So we're going to dive into choosing a backing, and then going into choosing a batting or two, and then looking at thread type, and last but not least, actually loading the panel onto the frame, because when panels have borders, especially ones that are printed on like the one behind me, it's a lot easier to go ahead and load it the proper way first to save yourself all the headache going through the panel and getting to the end and it not being what you want. Now that can help with panels, and it can also help you with quilts that have borders in your everyday life. So your customer quilts or your own personal quilts that have borders that are sewn on, putting the quilt on this way that I'll show you really helps you get it perfectly straight and helps alleviate any extra stress or tension that you have throughout the quilting process. So starting out first, let's look at choosing a backing. So we're going to go overhead and we're going to take a look at choosing a backing for this panel. You'll notice that this panel has a lot of colors in it, which plays into your hand for choosing a backing. You've got a lot of different sages: olives, greens, teals, aquas, I said sage already, lavender, lilacs, golden yellows, reds, oranges, crimsons, all sorts of different pieces, black, different colors in this panel, which can really help you choose a backing. But the kind of first color I saw when I looked at the panel was a purple lilac color. So we can pull that back up here again. More of the purpley lilacs and the pinks, that's kind of what my eye was drawn to. So whatever your eye is drawn to primarily is, in my opinion, what you should go for the backing if you find something that works. You'll also notice with most, if not all, of these colors, besides the black and the dark gray around the center medallion, it has kind of like a gradient tone in all of the colors, kind of like a texture tone in there, so you're going to see different underlying tones of that color that they're trying to show you. So when looking there, you can also see if you can find a backing that has that same type of undertone of a texture, a tone on tone, a gradient kind of look, and that helps tie the whole piece together when you're choosing what you want. So I found two different backings that I liked, and for different reasons. So these two are by Oasis Fabrics. They're etchings, backings, 118 inches wide. This one is more of like a wine plum color, and this has that kind of gradient undertone with a little bit of black in it, which helps work for the black negative space that you have in the panel. And then I also found more of a purpley lavender kind of lilac undertone on this one. That would work really well for all of the purple colors that you have in it. So even if I rotate the panel a little bit, all those purpley colors that are built into the majority of the flowers and in throughout the border section, even the sashing sections, it works really well with that backing. So it comes down to which one you like the most on it. I love the wine dark purple with the black undertone section. I really enjoy that. However, I thought the negative space was dark enough that I thought a nice contrast of color on the back, so a little bit of a lighter section to bring the brighter part of that panel to life. I thought that on the back would look really pretty and stunning to kind of contrast against the black. I also think that when binding this quilt, because there's so many bright colors, binding it in a black would give it nice contrast on the backing, and having that black would frame it nicely. So if you do want to turn this around and have a two-sided panel at that point, you could have a nice whole cloth on the back that's framed in black, and then on the front, of course, you have your beautiful flamenco panel here. So that just kind of gives you an insight of looking into backing. So you can find multiple different options, but it really comes down to what your personal preference is in it. But I did like the undertone to contrast the black negative spacing on the front. So now that you have your backing picked out, we can start hopping in to batting and thread choices. I'm going to go with, let's do thread choices first. So I'll slide the backings out of the way, bring the panel up here again. And I found a couple of different threads that I wanted to work with on this one. And I want to do the majority of my quilting on this will be stitch in the ditch, like we talked about in the first episode. So stitch in the ditch is achieved, sorry, I'm trying to grab the right thread for it, really well with a thinner thread, because sometimes with stitch in the ditch you have a little bit of a problem getting it right in the ditch based on how the fabric is ironed or how it's pieced. In this case it's just a print, so we kind of have a little bit of a leg up on the competition. But having a thinner thread, I'm going to be using micro quilter. So this is 7010, it's black. Micro quilter is 100 weight, and when you're looking at thread, the higher number of weight, the thinner the thread is. So this is a very thin thread, and all of the stitch in the ditch on the quilt, I'll be doing it with black micro quilter. Now the first thing you think of when you say that automatically is how are you going to get away with in your head using black thread on all of these bright colors to do your stitch in the ditch. Reason being is because micro quilter is so thin, when I'm doing my stitch in the ditch around these brightly colored, I'm trying to get myself some more thread, there we go, around these brightly colored arcs, once I hit that ditch, because I'll be taking it a little slower with a thinner thread with micro quilter, once I hit that ditch, it's going to give it a shadowing effect and look like it was part of the actual design itself, and it's going to hit it just beautifully and add a little additional shadow to it. I don't know if you can see 100% on the camera what I'm talking about, but it just adds a tad bit of shadowing there that really helps to accentuate the overall idea of this panel, which is layers and dimensions. Okay, so having that extra thin layer of black in there would help out. It's also going to allow me to do all the stitch in the ditch in this black side, so that won't even be seen. May add a little bit of shadowing to the actual stems. And then, of course, in the feathers and the flowers, or not the feathers, in the flowers and the petals, it's going to add in that additional shadowing as well. Same idea from right here. Now, in the background, whether or not you choose to do the micro stippling that we talked about in the first episode, or if you want to go with cross hatching like I'm planning on doing, I'm still going to use the exact same thread. I want to have a thin background thread so it doesn't take away from the actual panel. It just adds to it with the quilting. If you're a little bit on the edge about using such a thin thread, you could get away with using bottom line on the top, which is a 60 weight thread, or you could do so fine, which is a 50 weight thread. Either one, you could go with those, but going a little bit thinner will really help with your stitch in the ditch and also all of your background quilting. Even if you stitch it really, really tight, it won't pop as much as like a normal 40 weight or 35 weight thread that you would naturally be using. So all the stitch in the ditch along with background quilting will be done with micro quilter. It's kind of the first idea that I had to go with. So I'll set that to the side. The next thing that I want to take a look at is the leaves and the border. So I'll look at these leaves first since we're already here. In these leaves, we talked about in the first episode adding feathers in right here to go with the natural droop and slump of the the leaves that have the little petal looking lines in them, and then adding stems and veins into the ones that just have the straight curve. And so since this fabric has gradiating tones and your leaves have kind of that teal aqua hit in them, let me straighten this out a little bit more, there we go, this teal aqua hit in them, what that's going to allow you to do is hop in with a variegated thread to do your leaves in these sections, and come in and do your leaves in the border that surrounds the panel. So I found this Forest Affinity thread, and this has got some blue undertones in it, some darker green undertones, some olive, and some sage, which is primarily what those leaves are made of, like we talked about. So I can do my feathering work in that. Now this thread is thicker than the micro quilter, and that's really what I wanted. I wanted these leaves to pop as well with those feathers and kind of have those feathers dancing around in that section. What I can also do with this variegated is, because we planned on doing feather work in the border here, I can use that across this whole section as well. It's gonna blend in with those leaves really nice, and it's not going to stand out so much in the black because there are darker greens in this variegated. It's going to look more like feather wind, and the wind is kind of pushing those leaves in the direction counterclockwise around the panel. So this forest affinity for that would be absolutely beautiful. I like that it has those blue undertones as well to match in with the aqua that will be going all the way across this. So that's going to handle the leaves and the border leaves. Then I'm going to come in with the First Kiss glide, and I'm going to put that in the sashing sections that we're going to have. Looking around the sashing, the majority undertone that I saw in this was like a coral salmon. Even in some of the purples and in the yellows, it had, and even some of the darker the browns. It had a little bit of that corally salmon undertone throughout the whole process. So this First Kiss has a very light touch of that. It's like bone, but it's more of a linen type of bone. So it's really, really pretty to work on this section, especially doing whatever we plan on doing. This one will have the hearts here, and then if we do the L's and the E's up in this section, then it'll work with those as well. But it'll really accentuate it quite nicely throughout this whole section. So that's going to take care of top thread across the quilt. So I have 3 colors that are going on top. I've got the micro quilter, which will be done for all of the stitch in the ditch on the quilt. I've got the Forest Affinity, which will go in all of the leaves in the border. And I've got the First Kiss glide, which will go into the little sashing pieces on the top. Now that brings the question to which thread am I going to use for the back? Am I going to wind bobbins for each of these and switch them out? Or am I going to have one, primary undertone color to go on the back? I decided to actually go with Grape Glide. This is 40265. And I'm going to keep this for the bobbin across the whole entire quilt. Now I will caution you to let you know that you're going to have to play with your tension a little bit when you start mixing different weights of threads to go together. Glide with glide is going to work fine, glide with affinity is going to work fine, but micro quilter with glide you're going to have to play with your tension a little bit to get it to work exactly the way you want it. Now if you don't want to go that route and you kind of want to stay away from tension as much as possible, you could go with a black glide 40 on top to do your stitch in the ditch. It's just going to be much more predominant, and I think it's not going to attack the panel the way that you want it to. It might overshadow some of the panel if you try to do it for your stitch in the ditch, but that's just my opinion. If you want to stay away from bouncing threads and playing with tension. But I think the most comfortable way to get into mixing different weights and understanding how things work with different types of quilting is to experiment a little bit with different types of weights of thread. The Grape Glide as well, let me move these off to the side, will work absolutely beautifully with the backing, which is what it's going on. So it'll disappear, it'll look like a beautiful whole cloth on the back as well. Which was kind of the goal that I wanted to take it in the beginning. So we talked backing, we talked thread and what colors and where they're going to go. Now let's talk batting. Big one right here. So we spoke about in the first episode different quilting, and I mentioned 2 layers of batting for this one. And the reason I mentioned 2 layers is because there will be more open space and we plan on doing background quilting in different sections and stitch in the ditch. It would be really nice to kind of get that faux trapunto look and have these different sections puff up, and then when we quilt, everything kind of gets sunken down and really just shows off the different dimension of the panel. So looking at that, I decided this panel itself, I guess this is the first thing I should take you through. What is the end goal for this panel or for a quilt that you're wanting to make? So my end goal for this is I want this panel to end up being a wall hanging. I want it to come out during the spring, maybe have a showcase in fall, but really come out in the spring and be hung up to brighten up the room and you kind of have that fresh spring feel. So with it being a wall hanging, the first thing my mind goes to is Linda's Choice batting, 100% cotton with a scrim. So Linda's Choice is a thicker 100% cotton, more dense, I guess is the right word, and it's going to give the quilt nice body and nice shape, especially for it being a wall hanging. So wall hanging, show quilts, table runners, placemats, anything like that. Linda's Choice is always kind of the batting to go to because it's going to have nice body to it and retain its shape really well. Now, I did want to double layer this to have more poof, because this doesn't have a whole lot of poof. There's not a ton of loft in it. It's primarily made to maintain shape of the quilt. So this would be my bottom layer of my back. So I will move this the panel away. So this would be my bottom layer for the back. And then on the top layer, I'm going to go with wool to give it the poof, that extra loft to it. So I've got the Hobbs Heirloom Wool. This is going to give nice loft to the actual panel itself. So when I lay that on top of the piece, then I have that, excess of poof that's going to happen, that beautiful amount of poof. Now, one thing to talk about with wool or the poly products, or even some of the 80/20 products that Hobbs makes, they're heirloom products. When you get them, you need to take them out of the packaging before you plan on using it, because they're compressed into the bag for shipping purposes. So when you open them up, this wool, I mean, this has been open for a while, but when you open it up, it might be super duper thin and you might not be happy with it. Speaking from experience, let it poof up a little bit. If you don't have time to let it poof, toss it into an air fluff dryer to really get its fluff going and back to its natural state. You'll be much happier with the heirloom product line from Hobbs when you take a little bit of that patience and let it poof up naturally, or toss it in an air fluff dryer, no heat, for it to poof. So those would be my two layers for this wall hanging. Now let's say I'm doing something for a bed quilt and that I want to cuddle up and use. Linda's Choice, again, is a dense, heavy batting. If you want a super heavy, dense quilt, it's the way to go. But for a bed quilt per se, I personally, this isn't my kind of go-to because it might be a little too stiff for that. So I'm going to either go with a bleached white 80/20, or I'm going to go with a natural color 80/20. Either one you can go with, just depending on your backing. Because this backing has more of bright white undertones to it, I would go with a bleached white to keep its natural color shining through. But if you're going with more of a natural color backing, you could go with a natural 80/20, or if you're doing a really, really dark backing, you might want to go with a black 80/20. I didn't have a sample of that, I should have done that, but a black 80/20 on the bottom layer. I'm still going to do wool on the top layer, no matter which one I choose, so I choose the bleach. Set that off to the side. I'm still going to do wool on the top layer because I really do want that quilting to shine through, especially for a bed quilt. It's going to be nice and cozy, comfortable, warm, breathable, and show really nice texture and dimension when the light hits it just perfect. Another cool thing about wool, actually, reason we're using it on top layer, not only for the poof, but wool does not have a memory for creases. So when I talked about this panel coming up and being a wall hanging throughout the year, well, I'm going to fold up this quilt and store that away, or this panel, and store that away and do whatever I need to throughout the rest of the seasons. And then when I want to bring it back out for spring, I'll take it out, I'll unfold it, and because we have 100% cotton fabrics on top, you're going to get some creases in the fabric. But having wool, if you let it lay out for just a little bit, so like say you take it out a day or two before you plan on doing anything with the actual panel, the wool will loft back up naturally and push out all of those creases, and you'll get a beautiful finished product for what you're looking for in that standpoint. So that's kind of the preparation stage of looking at your quilting. We're starting with backing to find what we want. Then we're going to dive into the different types of thread that we want to use for the quilt, or the same one thread all the way through, and then determining what batting we want to choose for our project to get the exact result that we are wanting. Now that you've got that determined in your section, we're going to want to be able to either purchase our backing or use stuff from our stash. With your backing and your batting, make sure you have enough extra on all sides if you're doing it, and please make sure you have enough for your quilter to do it if you're sending it off to be quilted. You're looking at about 4 to 6 inches extra all the way around, not just on one side. And you want that for backing and batting to make sure the quilter, or you as the quilter, is comfortable enough loading it on the frame and getting that done for you. So in the spirit of loading, we are going to take our backing and our batting, which I already have cut and prepped, take that over to the machine. I'll get that loaded on, and then I'll meet you back for how we are going to load the panel onto that piece. Here at the machine, I've got the backing and the batting loaded. Remember, we were doing that 2 layers, so I've got Linda's Choice on the bottom and I've got wool on top. I already have the panel centered and placed on the fabric. And what I want to do here is there is no stitching right now at all. I just have it laid down. And when I do custom quilting, I always like to load my quilts a little bit of a different way. And so I thought I'd show that to you. Just as a reminder, I've got that micro quilter on because we're about to do Stitch in the Ditch. Okay, I've got that black micro quilter on. And I'm starting at the furthest in, so the most inner border seam right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in this left-hand corner. Again, there's no basting or anything, it's just laying down here. And I like to take a single stitch right here in the corner and pull up my thread. And I'm going to tie and bury my threads throughout this process, so you want to leave a nice string of them so you can tie them manually. And what I'm going to do now is start in the needle down position. When you're doing custom quilting, it's nice to have a needle down option. So whenever you stop, the machine stops in that section too, and it doesn't have any jerk in the stitching. And because this panel is nice and free, what I can do now is, while I'm doing Stitch in the Ditch at 14 stitches per inch, I can manipulate the panel ever so slightly to make sure that these inner border seams are all perfectly straight. If I just started basting right on the top here and then went down, these borders could be wacky, especially one with it being printed. But if you have borders that you have pieced together, getting that seam nice and straight, because that's the first thing your eye is going to go and look at, is that seam straight. Get that straight first, and then come back and do everything else that you need to do. So I've got that pulled up, and I'm just going to begin stitching. And I take it really slow when I do Stitch in the Ditch. Nice and slow. But that allows me to manipulate the panel, or the quilt, whatever I'm working on at the time, to get borders nice and straight. I don't use a ruler. I'm doing my horizontal channel lock. I forgot to mention that. So I do have a channel lock turned on, so I know I'm staying nice and straight. And I just slowly manipulate the border to get it exactly the way that I want to. So in the order of this, I would stitch this one straight all the way across, this first inner one. Then I would go to the outer portion of that, stitch that one, then come up to this one and stitch that one, and then at the very top I'll just do basting. And then once those all 3 are done, then I'll do the sides, left and then right. And then I'll start working on my quilting. I'll roll up the quilt, do any additional Stitch in the Ditch that I need to, and then I will start on the quilting. So that is your first order of quilting, and then we get to look at that in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learning a little bit more about the process of preparing your quilt, panel, or any type of project to be quilted, looking at different threads, battings, fabrics, and last but not least, the most important part, loading the quilt onto the frame the proper way. I'll see you in the next episode as we take a look at order of quilting along with starting the quilting process of this beautiful panel.